Today's debate is co-hosted by NHK World and the French Institute of International Relations, or IFRI, France's leading think tank. Our panelists are Thierry de Montbrial, the founder and executive chairman of IFRI. He is an expert in economics and analyzes political trends in Europe. Werner Patzelt, a professor at Dresden University of Technology. He's been researching how far-right ideologies affect the German political system. Chantal Mouffe is a professor at the University of Westminster who is from Belgium. She is a leading researcher at the university's Center for the Study of Democracy. She analyzes political systems from a leftist standpoint. Barry Bennett from political consulting firm Avenue Strategies. As a senior advisor to the Trump campaign, he traveled across the United States listening to the voices of American people.
Hello and welcome. What if the whole world was ruled one day by populists? Would it be a risk for our civil liberties, for freedom of expression? Would it mean moving from democracy to dictatorship? What is the current situation of populism? How has it developed? What are the challenges it has to face? Thank you, all of you, for being here and for having us. I suggest that we focus first on the current situation of populism as a kind of short introduction. I insist on short introduction. I have a question. My first question goes to Thierry de Montbrial. Since populism has a different meaning whether you live in the United States or, let's say, in South America, how would you define the word, especially here in this western part of Europe, compared, for instance, to the eastern part of Europe?
Well, as you know, good questions are not to be answered. And the first thing I would say is that there is no agreed definition of the word populism. It's a highly complex concept. Second remark, I think that the reason why all over the world, or almost all over the world, what we call populism gains weight is that the world has fundamentally changed because of the technological revolution, with an S, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has reopened entirely the international scene. In my judgment, the two are fundamentally interrelated.
Yes,
and therefore, there is a there has been a growing dissatisfaction in many places in the world, because with technology you have more and more inequalities and all the things which go along with technological industrial revolutions in general, growing inequalities, interdependence which is not yet properly regulated, and I use the word regulation in a very wide sense. Mm-hmm. And in my judgment, this is the fundamental cause of what we call populism today.
Okay. Werner Patzelt, you come from a country where is supposed to be a populist party. Its name is AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany. Some don't describe it as populist. It's not in my intention to settle this debate. My question is, do you think that the development of this party is due to this so-called wave of populism throughout the world?
I think that there can hardly be any doubt about the fact that the AfD is the German form of right-wing populism, which is spreading all around Europe. All the core elements of populism are present in the case of the AfD. It's some kind of oversimplification of political analysis, of over-banalization of political language. It's giving expression to the feeling that we, the people, are down here, and though the elite are not listening to us or ignoring our desires, are not acting in a responsive way, therefore we have to show them what they should do. There is the feeling that there is something like a true will of the people, and we, the Alternative for Germany, we know the true will of the people, and we are trying to represent it in Parliament. So all these ingredients are present, maybe with one exception, what is not so visible in the case of the AfD is the type of demagogic political leader, this kind of condottiere who tries to gather, so to speak, political soldiers around to build a force behind him to play an active political role. This is not so nicely visible in the German case, but all the other important elements of populism can be seen in the case of the AfD.
Barry Bennett, there have already been populists in the United States, in your country. Do you think that Donald Trump's victory is due to the fact that the revival of this philosophy was helped, for instance, by Brexit? Because we read this here in this part of Europe.
I don't. I think populism is not a disease, it's a symptom. And I agree with you that the rise of populism, there's a direct correlation between the changes in technology, automation, the workers are having a tough time finding jobs, keeping jobs in today's. But it's also, at least in the United States, a factor of failed policies. Policies that in this day and age just don't make as much sense as maybe they did 30 years ago. And that's fueling it. But in populism in the United States, Bernie Sanders, who was running on the left, is entirely populist.
I have a question on
Good.
him
I love Bernie.
on.
And so is Trump on the right. So it's really not an ideology. It was a group of angry people on both left and right, but also largely in the middle.
Chantal Mouffe, when we look at the European Parliament right now, we have 751 members of parliaments. 212 are considered populists. So it means that the development of this philosophy, as I said a while ago, started before Brexit. When could we say that this populist wave exactly began in our continent, in Europe?
Well, first, I think I would want to clarify how I'm going to use the term populism.
Yes.
Because, as Thierry de Montbrial said, there are many definitions of populism. And usually, the definition that you are using to denigrate the populist and to speak, populism is demagogy. Well, I am using the term populist, I mean, in an analytical way. I think that, for me, populism is a way to establish the political frontier. Politics is always establishing a frontier between us and them. But the us and them can be, constructed in many different ways. And the populist way to construct a frontier is to construct this frontier between us, the people from the underground, let's say, and against them, the establishment. I want to insist that according to the definition, populist is not an ideology, does not have a particular content, is certainly not a regime, because it depends, and there are many different forms of populism, as my neighbors have just said, and it depends on the way the us is constructed, and the them, and also the kind of relation which exists between the us and the them. What you are referring to about the fact that they are in the European Parliament many more MPs which comes from a populist movement, I would say I think that we are today in a populist moment.
Thierry de Montbrial, you wanted to add something apparently.
I like very much this distinction between us or we and they, but there is a double distinction, that is we the people and they the elites, but the other distinction is we the Americans, the French, the whoever, the Germans, and they the rest, the barbarian, that is the rest of the world, and they play, usually the so-called populists play on the two meanings, on the two sides of this distinction.
Barry Bennett, some people in America say that Donald Trump wouldn't have won the presidential election if Bernie Sanders had been appointed by the Democrats. If it is true, does it mean that a kind of, once more, left populism could be the answer to a right populism?
Well, I don't believe it's true that Bernie Sanders would have a chance of winning in a general election. But if you look at his supporters, they were all quite young, very young.
Yes.
And many of them...
Unlike himself.
Unlike himself. And they weren't socialists, unlike himself. They were just frustrated. A young person in America today I mean, I went to college, I worked as a janitor and paid my own way through college. That is impossible today in America. When I got out of college, I got a job, albeit it was in Congress, but I got a job. Today, the unemployment rate is astronomical. So they don't see a future. They don't see the promise that even their parents had. So they're quite frustrated and they're angry and they don't believe Washington cares about them and think there's demonstrable evidence that they don't. Instead of worrying about the cost of a college education, Washington argues over what interest rate we should charge on their student loans. Ridiculous arguments. So they're very frustrated. And that's who was turning out at Bernie Sanders rallies. They were not traditional Democrat voters. They were new folks.
Chantal Mouffe.
I think that for me, Bernie Sanders is definitively an example of what I call left-wing populism. And it might be true that among the young people who were voting for him, there was a lot of frustration, but originally. But what Bernie Sanders managed to do is to give some kind of progressive form of expression to this discontent of the young.
Barry Bennett, some people explained Mr. Trump's success by the fact that he's a man of, quote, transgression. Could that only explain his success, or is his victory a kind of return to the roots of US politics, that is to say, people's power against, one word that have just been used, against the elites?
You know, the interesting thing about, there are a lot of interesting things about President Trump. One of them is that, he doesn't have any kind of dogma that he's been associated with for 30 years, right? He ran as a conservative, but he'd never really practiced any kind of conservative political beliefs. He's never been elected to anything before. But what he heard when he traveled around the country and had these massive rallies every day was he heard the pain. And that's what he attached to. Now, we'll see if his policies are all conservative or not.
Would you mean that other politicians wouldn't feel the pain the same way?
Yeah, yes, exactly, because they are limited by their policy. They can't admit that their policies failed, right or left. They're in a corner and they can't get out. He was not in that corner. I'm a conservative, and for years we have carried the water of the pharmaceutical industry. We tried to explain to Americans that, you shouldn't go to Canada and buy your pharmaceuticals at 40% off because they might not be less safe. But hogwash. It was hogwash. We were carrying this baggage for 40 years, and he doesn't bring that baggage to the argument. So that is very refreshing to me. I think that every month, we've gone through the same recession you guys have gone through around the world. And every month, the government puts out an unemployment number. And it shows that it's going down. Yet the people participating in the labor market is at an all-time low. And so every time you haven't been able to find a job, you've given up looking, and you see the unemployment number go down, you feel less and less like anyone cares about you. And that has been the rise of Donald Trump.
Chantal Mouffe, if I read your book on the political well, it is apparently because there are no more political fights that we see a development of populism. Apparently, our liberal society has long pretended that we live in a time of political consensus, that we shouldn't waste our time fighting. Is that the way you see the everyday situation?
What I think is that is the possibility of choice between politics. This is what is disappeared because of the consensus of the center-right and center-left offer the same kind of politics. So there is no choice, there is no more popular sovereignty. Some people, of course, might not agree with me. I think this is a consequence of neoliberal globalization. This idea of popular sovereignty has been really eliminated. In fact, sovereignty is really the main enemy of neoliberalism because they want to impose the sovereignty of the market. So popular sovereignty is something they don't want.
You allow me one transition to Germany. Werner Patzelt, according to the British weekly newspaper, The Economist, I quote, "The far-right alternative for Germany has more likes on Facebook than any other German party, over twice as many as the Christian Democrats of Angela Merkel, despite having less than half as much support in polls. How do you explain this?
See, we in Germany have a strong tradition of aiming at coalitions of being governed from the center and not from the wings of the political spectrum, which, by the way, goes back to the 16th century, to the end of the 30 Years' War, when reconciliation was simply necessary to keep the country running. Now, we have had, after the Second World War, so to speak, cutting away the edges of the political spectrum. We did not have a really political communist left. We did not have a fascist or Nazi right party. So the whole party system was concentrating in the middle. Yes. And after reunification with the second and the third Grand Coalition, we even had government from the middle of the political spectrum. Therefore, no alternative to the politics imposed or conducted by the political class seemed to be available. And which made things further is that the spectrum of what was represented by Social Democrats and Christian Democrats did no longer correspond properly to the spread of political opinion and political preferences and interests among the German population. There showed up something which I like to call a gap of representation. Therefore, it was kind of a genius which brought the AfD to choosing as its name an alternative for Germany, and this is what brings them so many likes and much less votes.
Thierry de Montbrial, can we say that the Front National, the National Front, and other comparative political parties in the world develop because this party, and I will try to be provocative as much as I can, because this party gives new dreams to its audience, a new hope, in a word, brings back emotion to the political message. You can disagree with that, but it might be a fact.
No, no meaning I don't disagree, but that doesn't mean that I agree. I think there is no dreams in France today. And if you just look at the polls, there is a great disenchantment. And I think that many people who will vote for Marine Le Pen or for even for Macron, in fact, they will do it, but not with excitement or pleasure. Fundamentally, the National Front is addressing issues which are of key importance for the French. That is terrorism, uncontrolled immigration, uncontrolled refugees to a lesser extent. So these security issues. But you will observe, if you follow the campaign these days, that she's very, very cautious, even about Europe, because if she wants to be elected and she wants to have a chance to be elected, she distantiates herself from the usual extreme viewpoints associated with the far right or the far left.
A question to all of you. Do you think, do populists have to play with people's emotion in order to develop? Always and always and always.
I think people's emotions cause populism. I think it's a chicken or an egg argument. Populism is a fuel for a message, an ideology, right or left. But the underlying cause is anger, hopelessness, lack of dreams, complete and utter dissatisfaction, believing that your government doesn't care about you or people like you. Those are the causes of populism. That's what makes populism work. But it is a fuel, not an ideology. Everything.
Chantal Mouffe, regarding this issue of emotion?
Yeah, I don't want to put it in the way that play with emotions, because it says something like, the manipulator. Because I do believe that, and in fact, instead of speaking of emotion, I prefer to use the term affects. And I think that affects are absolutely crucial in politics. Politics is about creation of identification. Identification are the result of common affects. And I think that, unfortunately, many people, I'm consider myself, a left-winger. So I'm particularly interested in seeing what are the mistakes of the left. I think the left is much too rationalistic. The left believes that politics is a question of giving arguments, and everything which has got to do with affects is something which is probably, fascist and very dangerous. I think that's a very big mistake, because emotion or let's say affects can be constructed in different ways. And I think that if you believe that left progressive politics should not deal with affects, you leave the terrain of affects for the right-wing populists. And I think that they understand much better what is politics. For instance, they understand much better that politics is about constructing a frontier, mobilizing affects, and this is what progressive people do not understand.
Werner Patzelt, what do you think of this last statement?
Well, detecting that populism has to do with affects and emotions is like finding out that a circle has no edges, because affects are at the basis of cultural life, of social life, of even economic life. And politics is meant to make sense out of all of that, to give guidance or to give a certain framework to all of that. So politics is full of emotions of those who are engaged in politics or who are opposing politics or who are suffering from politics. And in fact, it has been a big mistake during the last liberal years to cultivate the feeling that politics is a matter of rationality, of clear strategies, calculations, avoid emotions. Oh no. And in the present time, where immigration occurs, there is a widespread feeling of loss of cultural identity. Yes. When globalization puts limits to people's sovereignty, as you put it before, then of course very deep emotions are concerned. And therefore it is absolutely no surprise that we see the rise of right-wing populism. And one of the main mistakes of the left and the liberals has been to try to get rid of emotions and to leave this whole field of emotions to the rightists alone.
I couldn't agree more.
But if I understand you correctly, all of you, can we say the following? In order to flourish, populists have to go on dividing the society in order to show that they don't look like the others. So can we say that populists are doomed to be always more extreme in a way?
That's the other way around.
Please.
That's the other way around.
Okay.
See, whenever populism occurs, it's an indicator of a crisis in the system of representation. Mm-hmm. If representation is working properly, then all of the people in one way or the other feel represented by the political elite, together with their emotions and their affects. But if a certain spectrum of feelings, of affects, of emotions, of political preferences is not mirrored in public political discourse, then you get a niche for populists. And in this niche, of course, it is of tactical use to play with emotions, to play with distinctions between we and the others and so on. But this is a secondary effect. The first effect is the gap of representation.
Chantal Mouffe and then Thierry Montbrial.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think that for representation to work properly, people need to have a choice. Because if you don't have, and when you go to vote, you can choose between center-right or center-left, which offer the same thing, you don't have a choice, and then you don't really have a representative system that works. And in fact, you were referring before, and I agree very much with that, the situation in Germany, and what you describe is exactly what I call post-politics. Yeah. And I think that this is the origin of the rise of populist movement, who against the idea that there is no alternative. They say, no, there is an alternative. We are going to give the people the right to decide. This is the main problem.
I agree.
Thierry Montbrial.
Thank you for giving me a chance to give my viewpoint on this. First, I think it's not a problem of representation because, in geography, there is no perfect mapping. It's impossible to have perfect representation and governance.
It's a dynamic system.
It is impossible. Second, I think the problem is not about emotions. It is about excessive emotions. And excessive emotions lead to Hitler. Excessive emotions lead to fascism. And social media here, media in general, technology, is at stake because it is a formidable machine to amplify emotions and to destabilize political situations, both internally and internationally.
Social media, which I think is incredibly important. I came to Washington with Ronald Reagan. Right? And he ran a nationalist, bring back the pride kind of campaign, very much what we're seeing today. But when I came to Washington, we had 3 television correspondents, 3 big news outlets. They all delivered the news at 6:30. That's when you got it. That was it. Largely the exact same broadcast. Today, for last week actually, when I looked this up, the 3 anchors of those networks had a combined 900,000 Twitter followers. Donald Trump has 15 million. Social media has changed the way to deliver a message to the mass.
The direct way of delivering a political message.
Interactive, personal.
That's very important.
Extremely important. And what's about to happen is going to change things even more. And that is that Facebook is going to start allowing ads and video feeds, which will make it possible for every political party in the world to have their own television station on a mobile phone and be able to, actually offset the cost of the content by these ads. That will change everything.
Chantal Mouffe?
I think that for me one of the main problems in France with the French press is that they are spending so much energy, so much paper in order to try to prove that Marine Le Pen is neo-fascist, she is not Republican, this is extreme right, precisely to say, well, there is nothing new about that. We don't have to try to understand why people are no voting for the Front National. We know already. And in fact, they think to be, well, some kind of atavism, Those people are basically, well, what Hillary Clinton used to call the deplorables, And in fact, I think this is not the way. This moral condemnation is not the way. They should need to try to understand why is it that those people are voting for the Front National? What is their demands which have been abandoned by the Social Democrats? For me, the main reason for the rise of right-wing populism is the failure of social democracy.
I would like to take this opportunity to generalize a little bit the problem. And I think that in our world today, there is a big question about truth. The fact that today, the concept of truth is questioned, and that many intelligent people give credit to the concept of post-truth or whatever it is called, is, I think, very characteristic of the world. That means that nobody can trust anybody, or any news, any fact, and that's very dangerous in itself.
The media has destroyed themselves over this last election, trying to weigh in one way or another, where they should have been out telling the stories of these people who were hurting and why they were voting such a way. But instead, they took a more elitist position and tried to weigh in with their own opinion. Journalism has been replaced with opinionism in the United States, and it has really hurt them to the point now, I don't know how they get their names back, their reputation back.
Would you describe the same situation in Germany regarding the press?
Yes, exactly. We have a lot of empirical studies on how journalists position themselves, say, in a scale between, say, 1 is extreme left, 7 is extreme right. If we do the survey with the population, we see that we have a normal distribution around the very center of the distribution. If we do the same with journalists in Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain, it was done, then we see that journalists are skewed to the left side for at least 1 point of a 7-point scale. So even if journalists do their job as they should do it, that is trying to find out what the facts are, trying to give an objective picture of reality outside, it's a different picture than that of the rest of the population. And therefore, it comes not as a surprise that ordinary people are trying to evade, so to speak, official media right now, with social media in all these echo chambers and filtering bladders and whatever exists in the world of the internet, and everybody comes up with its own truth. So you have facts, you have alternative facts, you believe what you want to believe, you believe what you get positive reactions on, and this is disastrous for democracy, because at the core of democracy is open communication, is debate on what is the fact and what is not the fact. And if you suspect all sources to be biased and wrong one, you won't have that public on which democracy and its communication is based.
Well, I want to react to that. I think truth is always a certain... form of interpretation. People, and obviously they are always the different angles on which you can report a fact. You know, so I don't think that there is an absolute truth or objectivity in the media. That's a little bit of exaggeration. You know, I don't think there are many of those. And I think that, of course, I agree. Today we are but that is a consequence of the social media, in which people can put absolutely everything that comes out their head without any check. But we should not believe that we are at a golden era of absolute truth, and no, we are not. No, I think things are a bit more complicated.
It is often said, and I've read this myself, history repeats itself. Do you think, it's a question to all of you, that the rise of populism is equivalent to the rise of nationalism in the 30s?
Start with a more general remark. There are no good reasons to believe that history repeats itself. There are really no good reasons. But
so it's nonsense.
There are very good reasons for the statement that the grammar of history remains the same. This means as long as basic institutional settings in the political system, in the economy, in how society works remain the same, then the framework for doing politics is roughly the same. The problems are differing, the political fashions are varying, but the framework is the same. And therefore we see time and again the same patterns occur. This does not mean that history repeats itself. It's like at a soccer game. You see many situations which are similar, although each soccer game is quite different from the other one. So having said this, it can hardly be overlooked that we again face some crisis of liberal democracy for different reasons today than in the post-World War I years. We see people feeling to be abandoned by the political class, hoping for somebody who knows to solve the riddles of the world, or at least of one's country, offering energetic political leadership. This is what we observe. But this does not mean that Hitler is reoccurring again, that history repeats itself. A certain class of problem reoccurs, and we have to find better solutions to them that our predecessors did in the past.
Even a Frenchman can have an opinion on this problem. Okay. So I think, no, history does not repeat itself, but you have a pendulum situation in history. That is, you move in a certain direction, then progressively people forget about the past, and therefore the pendulum then moves back in the opposite direction. And I give you just two examples. One is about the European construction. Today, part of the populist problem is to blame the European construction for everything. Okay, but if this movement goes too far, the result will be the deconstruction of Europe. And I am one of those who believe that the deconstruction of Europe could lead in 10 or 20 years to wars, and I am serious, back in Europe. And then we would remind, perhaps after 30 years, that we would have had better not to forget about the European construction. Second example, inflation. For someone of my generation, in the 80s, the big problem was to fight inflation. The Germans still have the memory of Weimar Republic. Yes. But today, you can hear that everybody speaking about inflation speak it in positive terms. We want inflation back. So no, history is not back. The return of history is not a proper world, does not repeat itself. But the problem is memory, you know, because we are always mesmerizing on recent events, forgetting about the lessons of the past, because I believe that there is something like lessons of the past, and if only not to repeat the same mistakes. I agree with you, not in the same situations, but in similar situations, which is not exactly the same.
Werner Patzelt, Thierry de Montbrial has just raised a very important issue, which is Europe. Suppose Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany wins the election in Germany. Suppose its allies win the ones in France and probably in Italy. Let's not forget the next elections next year in Italy, probably. What will be the future of the European institutions and the future of Europe itself? What could be the future shape of the political union?
All the indicators, all we see in Europe give us good reasons to believe that loss of national democratic steering capacity is at the heart of many populist movements. Then we simply have to stop the path we have gone along in the past, using this bicycle theory of European integration. Europe is like a bicycle has to move forward, otherwise it will kick at one side or the other and be destroyed. And because Europe is so precious, we should not destroy it, therefore we have to go on with integration. I think this is the wrong direction. East German populism, for instance, is strongly anti-more Europeanization. Yes. And the migration crisis made it absolutely clear that no other European country wants to follow the former German example of accepting all refugees from all the world and then distributing them all across Europe in the name of European solidarity. So if this is true, then we simply have too much Europeanization, according to which all the European nation states who want to benefit from European integration, and there is much to benefit from, make their choice. Some of them are in the Schengen community, others are not. Some of them have the euro, others have not. Some of them share immigration politics, others do not. I think that this is the way we should move forward in Europe, and I think that a victory of Marine Le Pen, and God may save us from that, would exert a strong push towards this direction.
Just one remark about Europe. Let us not forget that it all started with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we were forced, to enlarge very, very quickly and to absorb about 10 countries which were fundamentally unprepared to join the European Union. So now we have to absorb this huge shock of fast enlargement, which was probably unavoidable, but nonetheless, let us not forget that.
If you don't vote yourself for populists, what could you, what should be the reaction of the mainstream parties towards populism? Should they be more extreme? Should they change? Should they gather more actively in order to fight in a more violent way, maybe, against those populists? What should be the reaction of the so-called mainstream parties?
I think that they have to demonstrate that they can listen and persuade those folks that they have better policies. But ignoring them is death to the party. They have a communications challenge that some of them don't even recognize or refuse to recognize. They better recognize it, or they won't be around much longer.
Chantal Mouffe?
Yeah, well, I must say that I don't have much hope that center parties could face the challenge of right-wing populism, because they are, we are seeing already all over Europe collapse of social democratic parties. Let's say the election in Holland recently. So I used to think at some point when I wrote on the political, the hope for a renewal. Now I've lost my illusion, and I really think that the only way, and I know that is not necessarily very popular here, to fight against right-wing populism is to develop some form of what I call left-wing populism. By that I mean to be sensitive to what are really the demands of those people who are now voting for right-wing populist parties, because I think that, and for me this is crucial, behind all those, of course, those demands are usually expressed in a xenophobic way. But behind that, there is what I call a real democratic demand, because there are demands of people who have been, left aside, not listened to. And I think that what's important is to listen to those people and to try to articulate those demands in a progressive way. For instance, to the popular classes which are suffering, not to accept, tell them, no, the problem is not the immigrants, like Marine Le Pen tried to convince you. The problem is neoliberalism. The problem are the multinational. And this is what needs to be fought, to offer, and so it means a real transformation of politics. I don't believe that the actual consensus politics parties could really, they are much too rationalistic, they are much too negative with respect to the demands which are not. Look, there is real contradiction, because if those, what's happening today is a consequence of neoliberal globalization, it means that what you've got to fight is neoliberal globalization. You've got to come with another project. And it's not the center-right and the center-left, which are the one who have been the responsible for the development of those policies from which we can expect a real transformation.
Regardless of whether or not you agree with populists, can we say that in a certain way their development has forced mainstream politicians to step out of their sleep and propose a new political agenda to their voters? Can we say this? And at least we could say it has refreshed democracy, to be provocative. What do you think of that statement?
First, populism is a fact, so we don't have to like it or not to like it. It is a fact, and a fact which reflects, as we all say, fundamental uneasiness in our various societies. We have to recognize today that the world is heterogeneous and complex. Heterogeneous, I mean that we have to accept the fact that we are not all the same, we do not think the same at the same moment, and so forth and so on. So respecting difference, respecting the heterogeneity of the world, and trying to cool down emotions is very important. Today, the world is not to, the problem is not to have one global, liberal world in the ideological sense of 20 years ago. It is just to keep the world, I call, reasonably open.
Werner Patzelt.
Well, if my analysis is correct that the rise of populism is an indicator of problems in the system of representation, of problems in the relationships between political class and population, then of course the rise of populism is a challenge to established frameworks of the political class. It sets new topics on the political agenda, and it calls for new ways of analyzing what's going on in a country. So nearly everything depends on the reaction of the political class. The usual reaction, in particular in Germany, has been, well, these populists, we dislike them, they have fancy ideas, there is no reason for a sober and rational person to deal with all this stuff. Let's no longer talk about them, and let's never talk with them. This is an absolutely sterile reaction. The proper reaction would be, and it has started to become the normal reaction, is to engage in what I like to call close distance combat with populists. You have to enter in discussions with them, and you have to try to defeat them in front of a broad audience. In this case, however, it will not be sufficient to only react towards right-wing populism with left-wing populism, to oppose one narrative with a different one. You can do that, even with some success, but you won't be able to solve the problems out of which populism has emerged. Final remark, can populism revitalize democracy? We have seen in Germany a rise in the numbers of those who go to elections, even to state elections, by on average 10%, since the populists have become an important force in Germany, and this is revitalizing the political debate, and that is no bad news for democracy.
We have to think about it. Your conclusion, Barry Bennett.
I think that it's critical for parties of every ideology to demonstrate to people who are hurting that they are hearing them and they understand them. And to the extent that you just stay in your political class and espouse your traditional policies, that is not a road to success. These people are easily reached, and all you have to do is demonstrate that you listen and give them your solution, and you negate the entire effect of the problems.
Thank you. With these words, we close our debate. There would certainly be much more to say regarding this issue, but I do hope that we have provided a certain amount of answers to what populism is and how this political, I use the word philosophy, could affect our lives. I would like to thank once more our honorable guests for being here today, and also the French Institute for International Relations and its chairman, Thierry de Montbrial, for having us today. Thank you for following us wherever you are on the planet. Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you so much. Stay please on NHK World.